The last thing Jake remembered from civilization was the gas station attendant's weathered face, creasing with concern when he mentioned their destination. The old man had leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You boys be careful up in them Whitman Peaks. Ain't been right up there for years." Jake had laughed it off then, chalking it up to small-town superstition. Now, 3 days into their backcountry camping trip, he wished he'd pressed the man for details. The four friends had been planning this trip since college graduation 6 months ago. Jake, Marcus, Dev, and Tommy had all gone their separate ways after school. Different cities, different careers, different lives pulling them apart. This week in the remote Colorado wilderness was supposed to be their last hurrah before adult responsibilities took over completely. They'd hiked 12 miles into the Whitman Peak wilderness, far from any established trails or campsites. Marcus, ever the outdoorsman, had insisted on going deep, away from the weekend warriors and Instagram hikers. He'd found this spot on satellite imagery, a small meadow nestled between towering pines, with a crystal-clear creek running along one edge. "Perfect," he'd declared, spreading the printout across Jake's kitchen table months earlier. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. The first 2 days had been everything they'd hoped for. They'd caught brook trout from the creek, told stories around the campfire that stretched late into the night, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through pine boughs. It felt like being kids again, before mortgages and relationships and the grinding reality of 9-to-5 jobs. But something had changed on the third night. Jake woke to the sound of Tommy's voice outside the tent, low and urgent. He checked his phone, 2:17 a.m. Through the thin nylon walls, he could hear his friend talking to someone, though he couldn't make out the words. What struck him as odd was that he could only hear one side of the conversation. "Tommy?" Jake called softly, not wanting to wake Marcus and Dev, who were sharing the other tent. The talking stopped immediately. Jake waited, listening to the familiar night sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. After several minutes of silence, he unzipped his sleeping bag and crawled to the tent entrance. "Tommy, you out there?" He unzipped the rainfly and peered out. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of their gear scattered around the site. Tommy's tent sat dark and silent across the fire ring. Jake's heart rate quickened. He'd definitely heard his friend's voice just minutes before. He considered waking the others, but didn't want to look paranoid over what was probably nothing. Tommy could have been talking in his sleep, or maybe Jake had been dreaming. He was about to retreat back into his tent when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their campsite came a perfect imitation of his own voice. "Tommy, you out there?" The voice came from the wrong direction entirely, somewhere past the creek, deeper in the woods. It was his voice, exact in every inflection and tone, but wrong somehow. Too flat, like a recording played back on cheap speakers. Jake's mouth went dry. He grabbed his headlamp from beside his sleeping bag and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the campsite. Everything looked normal. Their bear canister hung from a distant tree, their boots lined up outside the tents, the cold ashes of the fire pit. "Guys," he called louder now. "Marcus, Dev, you awake?" He heard shuffling from their tent, then Marcus's groggy voice. "What's wrong, man?" "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Jake paused, suddenly feeling foolish. How could he explain what he'd heard without sounding crazy? "I thought, never mind. Probably just dreaming." But he didn't go back to sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag until dawn, listening to every sound, every shift in the wind. And twice more before sunrise, he heard voices in the darkness. First Tommy's, then Dev's, calling out words that made no sense, coming from places his friends definitely weren't. The next morning, Jake said nothing about the voices. In the bright sunshine, with coffee brewing over their camp stove and the normal rhythm of breaking camp underway, the night's events seemed surreal. Maybe he had been dreaming. Altitude could do strange things to sleep patterns. But as they hiked deeper into the wilderness that day, he noticed things that set him on edge. They were following an old game trail along the ridgeline when Dev stopped suddenly. "You guys hear that?" They all froze, listening. From somewhere ahead on the trail came the sound of footsteps, the distinctive rhythm of hiking boots on loose rock and pine needles. "Another hiker?" Tommy suggested, but his voice carried doubt. They hadn't seen another soul in 3 days, and this section of wilderness was notorious for its isolation. Marcus, who was leading, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hello," he called out. "Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. They waited in silence for several minutes but heard nothing more. When they continued hiking, Marcus moving more cautiously now, they found the trail ahead completely empty. No sign that anyone had been there at all. "Weird," Dev muttered. It got weirder as the day progressed. They made camp in another small clearing, this one perched on a rocky outcrop with commanding views of the valley below. As they were setting up their tents, Jake noticed Tommy staring intently at the tree line. "What is it?" Jake asked. "Thought I saw something moving over there." Tommy pointed toward a dense stand of pines about 50 yards away. "Something big." They all looked, but the forest was still and quiet. "Probably just an elk," Marcus said, but he sounded uncertain. That evening, as they sat around their campfire sharing a dinner of dehydrated pasta and trail mix, the feeling of being watched became almost overwhelming. Jake found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. The others seemed to feel it too. Conversations died out quickly, and everyone kept checking the shadows. It was Dev who first mentioned the sounds. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is tonight?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Now that he mentioned it, Jake realized Dev was right. The usual symphony of night sounds, owls, insects, small animals rustling in the underbrush, was completely absent. The forest around them was silent as a tomb. "Maybe we're spooking the wildlife," Tommy suggested, but his voice was tight with unease. Marcus stood up abruptly. "I'm going to take a leak," he announced, grabbing his headlamp. "Don't go far," Jake called after him as Marcus disappeared into the darkness. They sat in uncomfortable silence after he left, the only sound the crackling of burning wood. Minutes passed, then more minutes. "How long does it take to piss?" Dev asked. Tommy checked his watch. "He's been gone almost 10 minutes. Jake stood up, anxiety knotting in his stomach. "Marcus," he called out. "You okay, man?" From the darkness came Marcus's voice, faint and distant. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." But the voice came from the wrong direction, not from the nearby trees where Marcus had gone, but from somewhere much farther away, down the slope toward the valley. The three friends exchanged worried glances. "That didn't sound right," Tommy said quietly. "Marcus," Jake called again, louder this time. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." The response came immediately. Same words, same tone, but now from a completely different location, somewhere up the ridge behind them. Dev's face had gone pale in the firelight. "That's not Marcus." They grabbed their flashlights and headlamps, beams of light dancing wildly as they searched the surrounding forest. "Marcus," they called in unison. "Where are you?" "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." The voice came from 3 different directions now, overlapping slightly, creating an eerie echo effect that made Jake's skin crawl. Then, from the nearby trees where Marcus had actually gone, came his real voice, strained and frightened. "Guys, help!" They crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, branches tearing at their clothes. They found Marcus standing frozen beside a large pine tree, his headlamp beam fixed on something at his feet. "What is it?" Jake asked, breathing hard. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Look." In the soft earth at the base of the tree were tracks, footprints that started out looking human, but gradually became something else. The heel and toe were recognizable, but the proportions were wrong, too long and narrow. And there were claw marks at the ends where toes should be. "What the hell made those?" Dev asked. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but when I was doing my business, I heard something moving around behind me. When I turned around, I saw..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I saw something watching me. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but it was crouched down like it was trying to look smaller. And its eyes..." He shuddered. "Its eyes reflected my headlamp like an animal's, but they were too high up, too far apart." "What did you do?" Tommy asked. "I called for help, but then I heard myself calling back from the forest, multiple times, different directions." Marcus's hands were shaking as he held his light. "That wasn't me, guys. Something was using my voice." They returned to camp in a tight group, no one willing to be alone even for a second. The cheerful campfire that had seemed so welcoming now felt like a tiny island of safety in an ocean of darkness. "We need to talk about what's happening here," Jake said once they were all seated around the flames. "You mean the thing that's been mimicking our voices?" Dev asked. "Because that's what it's doing, right? Copying us?" Tommy nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. Last night, I heard what sounded like my own voice talking outside my tent. But I was asleep. At least, I thought I was." "Same here," Jake admitted. "I heard you talking to someone around 2 in the morning, but when I looked, you were in your tent the whole time." Marcus was studying the map by flashlight. "We're about 20 miles from the nearest road. Even if we hike straight through, it's going to take us most of tomorrow to get back to the truck. So we're stuck here for the night," Dev said. "We should take watches," Jake suggested. "2 people awake at all times. Don't let anyone go anywhere alone." They agreed to 4-hour shifts, Jake and Dev first, then Marcus and Tommy. But as the night wore on, staying alert became increasingly difficult. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound could be something approaching their camp. And the voices continued. Around midnight, they heard Dev's voice calling from the forest. "Hey guys, I found something cool over here. Come check this out." The real Dev was sitting right next to Jake by the fire. "Don't respond to it," Jake whispered. "Don't engage with it at all." An hour later, it was Tommy's voice, pleading from the darkness. "Help me, I'm lost. I can't find the camp. Please help me." Tommy sat frozen, listening to his own voice cry out in distress. "It's trying to lure us away," Marcus said quietly. "Don't listen to it." But the voices became more sophisticated as the night progressed. They heard conversations, two-way exchanges, that sounded like the friends talking to each other, discussing plans to leave early, debating which trail to take. The conversations came from different locations, sometimes overlapping, creating the illusion of multiple groups scattered throughout the forest. "How is it doing that?" Dev asked, his voice barely audible. Jake had been wondering the same thing. What kind of animal could perfectly mimic human voices? And more disturbing, how long had it been listening to them? Some of the phrases it repeated were things they'd said days earlier, around their first campfire. At 4 a.m., during Marcus and Tommy's watch, things escalated. Jake was pulled from uneasy sleep by urgent whispers. "Wake up," Marcus was saying, shaking him gently. "Wake up, but don't make any noise." Jake opened his eyes to find Marcus's face inches from his own, pale with fear. Tommy was beside him, pointing toward the edge of their campsite. "It's here," Tommy breathed. At the very edge of their firelight, something was moving. At first, Jake thought it might be a bear or an elk, just a large, dark shape shifting between the trees. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the shape was wrong. It was upright, roughly human in proportions, but too tall and too thin. And it was watching them. For several long minutes, they sat in terrified silence, staring at the figure in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make any sound. It just watched. Then Dev woke up. "What's going on?" he asked in a normal voice, and the thing in the shadows immediately vanished, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there. "Did you see it?" Marcus asked. Dev looked around, confused. "See what?" They described the figure, but Dev insisted he hadn't seen anything. Jake was starting to wonder if exhaustion and fear were making them hallucinate when they heard it, a sound that made all 4 friends freeze in terror. From the darkness came the sound of their entire conversation from just moments before, played back in perfect detail. Marcus's urgent whisper, "Wake up, but don't make any noise." Tommy's frightened breathing. Jake's sharp intake of breath when he first saw the figure. Even the sound of Dev stirring in his sleeping bag. It was all there, replayed with perfect accuracy, but coming from empty forest. "We're leaving," Marcus said, standing up abruptly. "Right now. We're breaking camp and hiking out in the dark." "Are you crazy?" Dev protested. "We'll get lost or hurt or—" "I'd rather take my chances with the forest than spend another minute here with that thing," Marcus shot back. Jake found himself agreeing. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent, it was patient, and it was getting bolder. The idea of waiting until daylight suddenly seemed like the most dangerous option of all. They broke camp by headlamp and flashlight, stuffing gear into packs with trembling hands. Every sound from the forest made them freeze. the snap of a branch, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl. They couldn't tell anymore which sounds were natural and which might be the thing mimicking the forest itself. As they prepared to leave, Jake did a final sweep with his headlamp to make sure they hadn't left anything behind. The beam passed over their extinguished fire pit, their scattered footprints, the trees that had sheltered them, and there, just beyond the tree line, dozens of eyes reflected back at him. Not two eyes like an animal. Dozens, at different heights, different angles, as if multiple creatures were watching from the shadows, or as if one creature had far too many eyes. "Move," Jake whispered urgently. "Move now." They hiked through the darkness, following Marcus, who navigated by compass and GPS. The trail was treacherous in the dark, full of loose rocks and hidden roots, but none of them suggested stopping. Behind them, always just out of sight, they could hear sounds of pursuit, footsteps that didn't quite match any of theirs, branches breaking in a rhythm that suggested something large moving through the forest. And always, the voices. Their own voices, calling out from the darkness. "Wait up," in Tommy's voice, but Tommy was right beside them. "I dropped my pack," in Dev's voice, but Dev's pack was secure on his shoulders. "This way," in Marcus's voice, trying to lead them off the trail they were following. They ignored all of it, focusing only on putting distance between themselves and whatever was hunting them. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky a pale gray, the sounds behind them gradually faded. The voices stopped. The feeling of being watched diminished, though it never completely disappeared. They didn't stop hiking until they reached their truck, parked at the remote trailhead where they'd left it 4 days earlier. Only when they were all safely inside the vehicle, doors locked, engine running, did anyone speak. "What the hell was that thing?" Dev asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Marcus replied, "and I don't want to know." Jake pulled out his phone as they drove toward civilization, searching for any cell signal. He had questions that needed answers, and he remembered the gas station attendant's warning about the Whitman Peaks. 3 hours later, they sat in a diner in the small town of Cedar Falls, nursing coffee and trying to make sense of what they'd experienced. The normalcy of the place, vinyl booths, cheerful waitresses, the smell of bacon and coffee, made the previous night seem like a nightmare. But Jake had made some calls during the drive, and what he'd learned made their experience even more unsettling. "I talked to a ranger at the Forest Service office," he said, keeping his voice low. "Apparently, there have been reports from that area for years. Hikers hearing voices in the forest, people getting lost when they follow calls for help that turn out to be coming from empty wilderness." "What kind of reports?" Tommy asked. "Missing persons mostly. People who went hiking alone and were never found. But also some survivors with stories like ours, voices mimicking their friends or family, leading them away from trails into dangerous terrain." Dev wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, trying to stop them from shaking. "So what is it? Some kind of animal?" The ranger wouldn't say directly, but he mentioned that the Ute tribe considers that area to be cursed ground. They've got stories going back generations about creatures that can steal voices, steal shapes. Marcus looked up sharply. "Shapes?" Jake nodded grimly. "The ranger said there have been reports of people seeing their own friends in the forest, calling to them, but when they follow, they find their real friends back at camp, asleep in their tents." The table fell silent as they considered the implications. How many times had they assumed they were hearing each other when they were actually hearing something else entirely? "There's something else," Jake continued. "I looked up the history of the area. The Whitman Peaks were named after a family that settled there in the 1800s. The Whitman homestead was abandoned suddenly in 1847. No one knows why. The family just disappeared. Left everything behind, like they'd fled in the middle of the night. Or like something drove them away," Dev said quietly. Tommy pushed his untouched breakfast around on his plate. "I keep thinking about those eyes. All those eyes watching us from the trees." "And the tracks Marcus found," Jake added. "Footprints that started human and turned into something else." Marcus was studying the map he'd spread on the table, tracing their route with one finger. "You know what bothers me most? How long was it watching us before we noticed? Those voices it was using. Some of them were things we'd said on the first day. It had been listening, learning. The waitress approached their table with a coffee pot and they all jumped. "You boys okay?" she asked, concerned by their obvious distress. "We're fine," Jake said quickly. "Just tired from camping." She refilled their cups and moved on, but not before giving them a worried look. "We can't tell anyone about this," Dev said once she was out of earshot. "They'll think we're crazy." "Are we crazy?" Tommy asked. "Did we actually experience what we think we experienced?" Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken during their trip. Most were normal. Landscapes, the group around their campfire, Marcus holding up a fish he'd caught. But there were others, shots he didn't remember taking. Photos of the forest at night, beam of a flashlight illuminating trees and shadows. In one photo, taken apparently during their final night at camp, something was visible in the background. A tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of the light, partially hidden behind a pine tree. The image was blurry, could have been a trick of shadows and branches, but the more Jake stared at it, the more convinced he became that it showed something standing upright, watching their camp. He showed the photo to the others without saying anything. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "How long was it there? And why didn't we see it when you took the photo?" Dev asked. Jake checked the timestamp. The photo had been taken at 2:47 a.m. during Marcus and Tommy's watch. But he had no memory of taking it. In fact, he'd been asleep at that time. "I didn't take this," he said slowly. They stared at the phone in horrified silence. "Then who did?" Tommy asked. The implications were terrifying. Had one of them taken the photo while sleepwalking? Or had something else used Jake's phone? Jake scrolled through the rest of the photos, looking for others he didn't remember taking. There were 3 more, all from that final night, all showing the forest around their camp. And in each one, that tall figure was visible, progressively closer to their fire. In the last photo, it was standing just outside their circle of tents. "We need to delete these," Dev said urgently. "We need to forget this whole thing ever happened." But Jake found himself reluctant to erase the evidence. What if other people had similar experiences? What if documenting this thing could help save someone else from what they'd gone through? "I'm keeping them," he decided, "but I'm also never going back there." They finished their breakfast in subdued silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The plan had been to spend another 3 days camping, but none of them suggested continuing the trip. They were done with the wilderness, at least for now. As they prepared to leave the diner, the elderly waitress approached their table one more time. "You boys were up in the Whitman Peaks, weren't you?" she asked. They nodded, surprised by the question. "I could tell. You've got that look." She glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "My grandson went hiking up there last summer, came back talking about hearing voices in the forest, seeing things that weren't there. Took him months to get back to normal." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The old-timers around here, they know to stay away from that area. There's something up there that don't like visitors, something that's been there a long time, longer than any of us." She straightened up, returning to her normal tone. "You boys take care of yourselves, and maybe find somewhere else to go camping next time." They drove home in Marcus's truck, taking turns at the wheel, none of them wanting to be alone even for the duration of a rest stop. The conversation was sporadic. Sometimes they'd try to rationalize what they'd experienced, coming up with explanations involving altitude sickness, sleep deprivation, or mass hysteria. But those explanations felt hollow when confronted with the evidence on Jake's phone. As they crossed into Utah, leaving Colorado behind, Jake felt some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Whatever had been hunting them in the Whitman Peaks, it belonged to that place, tied to that ancient forest. But as the sun set behind them and darkness fell over the highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't entirely over. It started with the radio. They'd been listening to a classic rock station, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, helping to fill the uncomfortable silences. But as they drove through a particularly remote stretch of highway, the music began to fade, replaced by static. Tommy, who was driving, reached for the tuning dial. But before he could change the station, voices emerged from the white noise. Their voices. "We need to talk about what's happening here," came Jake's voice from the truck's speakers. You mean the thing that's been mimicking our voices? Dev's voice responded. It was their conversation from around the campfire, played back with perfect clarity over the radio. All four friends sat in stunned silence as their own words filled the truck's cab. Tommy fumbled for the radio's power button, but before he could reach it, the voices changed. Help me, came Marcus's voice, distorted by static. I'm lost. I can't find the road. Please help me. Marcus, who was sitting in the passenger seat, went pale. Turn it off, he said urgently. Tommy punched the power button, and the radio went silent. But in the sudden quiet, they could all hear it, a sound from outside the truck keeping pace with them as they drove. Footsteps on pavement, the rhythm of someone running alongside the vehicle at highway speed. Jake looked out the window but saw only darkness. The truck's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but beyond that circle of light, anything could be out there. Floor it, Marcus said. Tommy pressed the accelerator and the truck surged forward. The speedometer climbed past 80, then 90. But the sound of footsteps kept pace, now coming from both sides of the truck. What is that thing? Dev asked, his voice tight with panic. Jake was watching the side mirror, looking for any sign of what might be following them. For just a moment, caught in the red glow of their taillights, he thought he saw something. A tall, thin shape running behind the truck with impossible speed, its two long limbs pumping in an inhuman rhythm. Then they crested a hill, and the lights of a small town appeared in the distance. The sound of footsteps immediately stopped. Tommy gradually slowed the truck as they entered the town limits, past a sign that read, Welcome to Millfield, population 847. They drove straight to the first gas station they saw, pulling up under the bright fluorescent lights. Everyone out, Jake said. Right now. They piled out of the truck and stood in the reassuring glow of the gas station's lights, looking back at the dark highway they'd just traveled. Nothing moved in the darkness beyond the town's edge. It followed us, Dev said, stating what they were all thinking. That thing from the forest. It followed us. Marcus was checking the truck, walking around it slowly, looking for any sign of damage or disturbance. But how? We drove for hours. Nothing can run that fast for that long. Maybe it didn't run, Jake suggested grimly. Maybe it's not bound by the same physical laws we are. They went into the gas station, seeking the comfort of normalcy, fluorescent lights, snack food, a bored attendant reading a magazine behind bulletproof glass. But even there, safe among the mundane trappings of civilization, they felt watched. While Tommy filled the truck with gas, Jake approached the attendant, a young woman with purple hair and multiple piercings. Excuse me, he said, have you ever heard any stories about the Whitman Peaks? About things in the forest that can mimic voices? She looked up from her magazine, studying his face with sharp intelligence. You've been up there, haven't you? Jake nodded. And something followed you back. It wasn't a question. Jake felt his blood run cold. What do you know about it? She glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer to the window separating them. My grandmother was Ute. She told me stories about the Yinal-Lushi, the skinwalkers, shapeshifters that can take the form of animals or people or something in between. Skinwalkers? Ancient things. Old magic turned dark. They're supposed to be tied to specific places, but... She paused, studying Jake's face again. But if you've disturbed one, if you've drawn its attention, sometimes they can extend their reach. Follow prey beyond their usual territory. How do we stop it? She shook her head. I don't know. Grandmother always said the best thing was to never encounter one in the first place. But if you have... She thought for a moment. Fire, maybe, sage, salt, the old protections, but honestly, distance is probably your best bet. Get as far away as possible and hope it loses interest. Jake bought a box of salt and some sage bundles from the store's limited spiritual supplies section, earning strange looks from his friends but no questions. They were past the point of questioning anything that might help. As they prepared to leave, the attendant called out to Jake. Hey. If that thing is still following you, don't stop driving until you reach running water. It can't cross running water. They drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel, each of them fighting exhaustion and the hypnotic effect of endless highway. The radio stayed off. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, afraid that raising their voices might somehow signal their location to whatever was hunting them. Around 3 a.m., Dev was driving when he suddenly swerved, causing everyone to jerk awake. "What happened?" Marcus asked. "There was someone in the road," Dev said, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, standing right in the middle of the highway. Jake looked back through the rear window but saw only empty asphalt disappearing into darkness. "What did they look like?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Like," Dev swallowed hard. "Like you, Jake. Exactly like you."